it's already encumbered 98%. So I just didn't know how that was working.
So in terms of, so we know what our premium is going to be for the year for
Okay.
the liability and the workers' comp
Right, okay.
insurances, and so at the beginning of the year we encumber the full amount on the PO, so we know what we might have left in that particular account.
Okay.
Although for the for the liability insurances, in addition, we also part of that funding would be if we have to deal with a deductible on a particular claim.
Okay.
So we leave funds behind for for that as well. And then if we add, sometimes like as the year goes on, we add vehicles and equipment and we take vehicles and equipment off.
Okay.
So depending on how it goes, like today we just received a check for $900 and some odd from Kerma because we took more the value of the items we took off was greater than what we put on during the last period that they did the analysis
Okay.
for.
Other questions?
I have a couple.
If you ask about that 8 cents on the top line.
I know, what was that? Yeah, out of
Go
curiosity.
ahead.
Fourth line down, overtime, $2,390.
Yes, so with the police, as you recall, their new union contract was settled right at the end of the fiscal year. And so because of that, we had to pay them retro wages, and we were able to get that accomplished by June 30th, and we had to do some transfers in order to accomplish that.
Okay. Going down to overtime boat duty, $3,593. That's is shared with Waterford, correct?
Well, we're taking it from that account. But in answer to your question, we have officers that go out on the boat as well as Waterford. But we pay our officers' wages and Waterford pays their officers' wages.
So the overtime is due to the summer, would you say? Summer traffic? Or?
Well, typically, but this transfer that you're questioning, the funds went from the boat account to the regular
Which was?
salary account.
The overtime for the police was for what, though?
Pardon?
The overtime for the police where the account, the $3,500 went into.
No, it came out of that account. Look
So-
at the
so
top.
It says
It's
to
from.
account.
So there was a savings in overtime for
boat.
boat activity. And so
Right,
they
I
took,
got that.
Yeah.
But it's going to the police officer's
So
account,
Yes.
which their overtime was due to, is what I'm trying to get at. All the affairs downtown. Am I clear? Or
I'm
not?
not understanding what you're trying
He's
to
asking
ask.
how come we're moving additional money into that overtime account. We're moving additional money into above what the initial estimate was for the police overtime.
It's all the regular salary account that we're moving the funds into, not the overtime account.
Okay. Okay. So that's the same issue for the grant overtime, the same thing.
Yes.
Money that was allocated for those
Yes.
things, but not needed.
And on the bottom for fleet fuel, it's going into road construction, reconstruction,
Yes.
for repairs or
Whatever was
Whatever we're doing.
necessary.
Okay. All right, thanks.
It
So-
is, but it's not. It's-
Yeah. Yeah, I started to, yeah,
It,
should say from to.
did you have a question?
yeah, so all of this overtime that was saved is going into the regular salary line item. Is that to be used in this current fiscal year?
No, that was for 6/30/19.
Okay.
That's what, these transfers.
So how much, so I can't imagine that the amount was exact, was it? So in other words, were we exactly short in the police officer's salary by all of those amounts?
Yes.
Okay, so there might still be some leftover money in the overtime account that goes back to the general fund?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And I have a question generally. You've had a number of these, the budget transfers, it's just part of the, we'll call it housekeeping
Mhm.
by the end of the
Yes.
year, right, which is necessary to do. And some look like they're one-time situations, but some look like they may repeat themselves or something like that. So are these documents, are they used by the departments going forward as they create their budget documents into the next year?
Well, the departments do have the ability to look at, they see what they expended the prior year, so they need to say, what are my needs gonna be next year? And then
Right.
sometimes, it's particularly with the public safety departments,
Mhm.
if they have somebody out, and especially the police, they're running a 24/7 operation. So the contract has minimum patrol staffing, so if they're down an officer, if you have an officer that's out for medical leave or hurt on the job or something, we need to fill the shifts, and so that always impacts what's going on
Mhm.
with our overtime accounts
Mhm.
or not. And then even with the wage account, if we have an officer that's out on workers' comp, well, part of that officer's salary is being paid through the comp carrier. So then in that account, we'd have a little, so it just always depends, it fluctuates, and it's difficult to project. I mean, you
Mhm.
can project based on what your base needs are, but when the base needs change for reasons that I've just mentioned,
Right.
then it changes
Okay.
everything.
Okay. So it's possible that the documentation is helpful in that regard, or the detail that you have here could help them when they're creating their budget accounts, but it's not necessarily, gonna reflect next year's reality, or, so, okay. Gotcha.
Any other questions about the fiscal year transfer motion that we have, or the proposal that we have before us? Hearing none, do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion to ratify departmental transfers in the amount of $47,909.68 processed for fiscal year end June 30th, 2019.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion to second. Any other conversations? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstained, so moved, 400. Thank you. Next agenda item is public safety overtime. Is that what you just went through before?
Yeah, we've kind of
More or less, but
been
this is,
touching on.
so the reason we provided the board with these reports is, I don't know if you recall during the budget process, the board indicated that it would be helpful to have some sort of prior year history to take a look at to help understand what these departments were actually asking for in terms of their part-time accounts and overtime accounts. And I will point out, when you look at the numbers, sometimes, so like last fiscal year, in the months of August, November, January, and May, we actually had 5 weeks in that month. So that would make the numbers in those particular months tend to be a little bit higher than the rest of the months. It's not necessarily due to something catastrophic that may have happened.
Why is January twice in the other months? Historically, it's not that high.
Well, January, I pointed out, last year was a 5-week month.
But it's 2x every other month, right? It's 12,600, everything else is 6,000 and 8,000, so sometimes down to 4.
Oh, and the overtime for Niantic.
Yeah, it doesn't seem logical. But it seems like every year January's high. Unless you go back to 16 where it's low.
And then, of course, this year, it's going to change because we added a new firefighter in each
Each one.
department. So their overtime, because every week, every day, they work a 9-hour day, so they each get 1 hour of overtime per day, 5 a week. So now we have an added an added firefighter in each department that will get that rate.
It just doesn't make sense to me that the part-time fire department is higher in January, and the overtime is also higher in January, both by a significant amount. So are we spending more time on part-time firefighters at the same time that we're spending more money on overtime?
We
I would
could have
expect
had,
this one would-
we could have had you know what, I can check that. We could have had a firefighter that was out for an extended period, regular full-time firefighter that was out for an extended period of time. And if that's the case, then it might cause another full-time firefighter to work overtime, as well as we would have more part-time staff come in.
I mean, it's good looking at the numbers in the aggregate, but, an issue is what specific overtime are we considering? Because there's also contractual overtime, being paid overtime for a holiday coverage or something like that, so,
But Flanders is doing the same thing. December is 7,000, January's 10,000 for part-time, but you go over to overtime, and overtime goes from 3,000 to 9,000. It seems like both fire departments, for some reason, January has a huge uptick. I mean, like, huge.
Some of it could be, sometimes when we have inclement weather, snowstorms, firefighters do go out, but in this past year, I don't really recall anything that was that rainy.
In
We had
this-
rain,
yeah,
heavy
January?
rains.
We had 150 some odd days of rain.
But in January?
We had some wet weather in the beginning of the year.
Yeah, but every year, January seems to have a spike, until you go back to 2016, in which case January is half of December. The data seems inconsistent. Police boat, 40,000 in January, overtime. Something funky's going on in January. And it seems to be a trend, at least for the last 3 years. Yeah, if you could see if there's some kind of abnormal activity that takes place in January every year, that would make this probably make more sense.
It's in dispatch as well, Bill. If you go to dispatch also, there's a big jump
Because they have
from December to
rain?
January.
It doesn't seem logical.
In the overtime,
Yeah.
right. There's that,
But I mean, during
So-
snowstorms, when there are a lot of accidents.
right. I mean, it makes sense if
Yeah,
they're
but
being cold.
Yeah, but February's worse than December, right? I mean, most years February's worse than January. Most years, not always, but
If we look at dispatch, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and you take November and you just add those two numbers together, 9,000 and 7,600, you get almost 17,000, which is almost the same as January. So wouldn't you almost have to add the two numbers together and then look at the sum and compare those?
it might be a rule and average kind of thing that would make more sense, but it just,
Well, or December is low. I mean, you can look at it that way as well,
Right.
What?
Because
I just-
December would be 8.
I know. And then
I
you
would
jump up.
expect, without looking at the numbers, I would expect if the part-time hours go up, then the overtime would go down and vice versa, right? And that's not what we see. In January, we see everything going up. So I don't understand the logic.
15, 3, 11, 8.
But I think,
Also in January, there was 5 there's 5 weeks as opposed to 4.
17
There's 5 pay weeks,
Mhm.
so that, that would have an impact of an additional week.
Mhm. So it could be.
There's, how many months? 4 months they have 5 pay weeks?
Yes.
Yeah.
You just said which 4 months? You-
So August, November, January, and May.
Excuse me. May. Okay.
Hmm.
Just one question. On the overtime for Niantic, if you look
Yes.
down what was budgeted, we're 3 years in a row at 67,000. But from 16 to 17, it jumped 6,000. But when you went from 62 and you stayed at 67 for 3 years in a row, and you saw that the total was over 70,000, why did it stay at the same 67,000 every year?
Well, some of it, when we're going through the budget process, actually, at this board level, rather than, sometimes the department will ask to increase it, and this board will say, well, let's just leave it as it is, and if you need more money during the year, come back to us, because we want to understand why. So it's kind of part of the process. I will say, though, now for Niantic, in this year's budget, their part-time firefighter budget is 156,809, and their overtime budget is 103,314. But the overtime budget, a portion of that has to do with the contractual obligation, and we added a firefighter, so that it's going to be greater this year. And the 2 chiefs that we currently have are really doing a very good job in terms of really trying to do detailed estimates in terms of what their weekly, monthly needs are. So we have some substantive documentation on how we're asking to budget.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of data here. And I would just ask of you, what are your takeaways from this analysis? What kind of assumptions can you make based on this data and these trends?
Well, if you just like for Niantic Fire, and you look at, for the most part, I think their activity has been rather consistent in terms of what their overtime is, for total end of year. However, we're not budgeting properly, because every year, our expenses are greater than what we're budgeting, and it's a
Right, but my takeaway from this, just at the macro level, is we've had the budget level for 3 years at 67,000 for Niantic Fire, bless you.
Oh, for their overtime. I was looking
Right?
at the part-timers, yes.
Okay, so I'm just looking at the overtime, for example, 67,000 flat for 3 years, and it seems to me, my takeaway from this analysis is that they're managing to that budget better in each subsequent year, because we've gone from almost 8,000 over, down to 4,000 over, and now down to 3,800 over.
I see your point.
Unless you look at the part-time at the same time, and then they're going the other way. They've gone from 300 to 15,000.
Recognizing, of course, 6/30/2020 is going to be higher because of the contractual overtime. But I don't know if my point is being made clearly for the rest of the board. It seems like when we have a stagnant budget, they manage to that pretty well.
Yeah, I understand your point. I think that if you're keeping the budget very conservative, that you'll operate in a conservative fashion, so it's not the worst thing. It just becomes.
And that's to the board's, the position that this board has taken in terms of well, let's leave it at the lower number. If you need money, come back to us.
And so I'm just saying that strategy appears to be working, perhaps. That's the only point I'm trying to make. That's my takeaway from the analysis.
We'll see next year.
Yeah, we'll see with the slightly different numbers for especially for Niantic Fire Department.
Yeah, Niantic doesn't look as much like that, but when you look at Flanders, they're doing a better job to manage
Yes.
to the budget.
I noticed that too,
Yeah,
that,
I know.
but you have a different situation now at Niantic Firehouse, so I think that may be reflected as we go forward in a
And
positive way.
I will also point out that with the police department being, now, since we've converted to independence, the overtime is being, when you look at that department, the overtime, the department has, I think, made their case during the budget process to get an increase in the overtime account, and they've done a good job at managing it. You know, they've said, okay, this is what we need, you need to give us this, and they've done a good job at managing it, and they've been able to deal with the shortfall with, taking it from somewhere else in the budget. But in prior years, they were substantially over what the overtime budget was. So somebody's really looking at that.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm. Definitely, the number came way down, and overtime for the police.
Okay,
So I don't know, is the board, is this something you want to get quarterly or annually?
I would appreciate an anomaly being called to our attention, but if things are going along pretty consistently, I don't think we need to be made aware of it.
but I think before the budget season would be a good time to get a report. So as we review budgets, we can look at trends and analysis and say, you guys aren't really managing to your budget.
So do you want this information to be included in your budget books,
Yeah.
or do you want it prior to that?
I would prefer the month before the budget so that we have time to kind of talk through it.
So you get the budget in March, so you would like this in February.
Yeah, I think.
Understanding that my opinion doesn't count, because I won't be here then. But I would think that the board would function better if we had time to look at the data and actually ask them questions. As opposed to those nights when we're going through the budget and it's just like drinking from a fire hose sometimes, because there's just so much stuff coming
Yeah.
at you.
Especially if points are being made that additional personnel are needed, and that may be fine in a separate argument, but when you're looking at this amount of information that concerning overtime and how it's being managed, I mean, that goes into the pie,
Because
so.
we frequently hear that they're going to increase part-time to decrease overtime. And it doesn't look like that's always happening.
Mhm.
It doesn't look like it's happening. Maybe there's just too much data here, and if this was prayed out or something, it would be more obvious, because you're right, the 5 weeks is skewing the data.
And it would be, it would be great if the department heads in question, who are covered here, also see these same charts, so that if we question them on that they have that data as well. Because, again, I always envision the scenario that, we will be asked about, additional personnel in various departments. So, this definitely is a part of the information that you need to make that decision if it's appropriate. And they need to see it as well, and can explain, contractual overtime versus unusual circumstances versus whatever else. Get into the nature of the overtime more specifically, So, for example, if one of the fire chiefs were here, I'm sure we'd be asking that question now.
So do we have a consensus for when you'd like to see this data?
I say February is good, and for the department heads as well,
Okay. Sound good?
That's good.
Okay.
Okay.
Annually in February sounds like a target.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you.
Alrighty then. Board of Finance bylaws.
Okay.
We had a possible amendment that we wanted to discuss. I'm sorry, was there any other questions on public safety overtime?
No.
Okay. Item C. We have a proposed amendment to our bylaws that we discussed briefly,
Yeah.
probably a couple months ago.
So, Mr. Chairman, this is on the agenda because it's my understanding that we have to talk about it in a meeting before we bring it to a full vote.
That's what I thought, and I thought you said last month that that wasn't exactly the way it
Um,
was, because I thought we had to propose it one month and then vote on it the next month.
Well, if you go to Article 9, which is the last page, the two provisions, one, the Board of Finance can suspend provisions of the bylaws when it deems necessary, which is pretty much for anything, except some required by law statutory issues, by majority vote. But the important sentence follows: the bylaws are amended by a majority vote of the entire voting membership of the board, only after the change has been read and discussed at a previous regular meeting. In theory, you could suspend that if you wanted to, but the point is, I think the idea is to get it on the table, get discussed, because it's probably hard to get an entire voting membership. So I think that whoever drafted this was thinking ahead, clearly that it's good to get some discussion on the table, and others who aren't here know it happened, can watch the video,
Right.
listen, look at the minutes, read the amendment, and then, boom, when we have the six of us together, we can vote. So it's sensible to me. There's no need to rush. Especially in the nature of this particular amendment is just the idea behind this amendment, which is to amend Article 6, the second paragraph, just to put a little meat on it, so that
I have no issues with
Yeah.
that at all. I think it's worded well, and I would be ready to adopt that or vote for that at a subsequent meeting.
So the way you read this, it has to have everybody present at the meeting to vote on it. It can't be the kind of thing that if we have a majority here and it's unanimous, then you have a majority vote,
Yeah,
which
because
is the way I read it.
yeah, I know it's so if you look at the preceding in Article 9, if you look at the preceding sentence, so we can suspend our provisions and by reaching a majority vote on the suspension. So that by Robert's rules, that's the majority vote of a voting quorum. Okay, so the next sentence concerning amendments was very specific about the entire voting membership of the board, which to me, created a different, circumstance.
But my point being, if, in this example, we had 6 members on the board,
Right.
2 of them aren't present tonight, but tonight we have a majority of the vote. If
Right.
this was unanimously moved, then it would be the majority of the board would say, moved it forward. That's the way I read it.
Yeah, I know you can, but I felt like there was an emphasis here that isn't present elsewhere in the bylaws, so that, and I think if you think about what you're doing, which is you're amending the bylaws, so it's okay to suspend something temporarily if you need to. You can just do a majority vote, but here you're actually amending permanently, or at least for a year period of time or whatever. So the feeling, I think, the spirit of this to me is have everyone vote on it.
So I will say that this was done in 2017, and I will say that I actually did write these bylaws and bring them before the board. And you are correct, that is exactly the spirit of that last statement. And so